Just skipping through. Yeah, so Paul goes to meet with Felix. He meets with Felix and his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. They sent for Paul. They heard him speak concerning faith in Jesus Christ. They discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment. Felix became frightened with what he's hearing, so he said to Paul, "Go from my presence, and I will send for you when I have an opportunity." And he did so often as he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. See that? This Roman governor used to pull Paul out of that dungeon a lot and say, "Come on, man, you ready to show me where you hid that money?" Next verse. Some days later, when Felix, his wife, here we go. Next verse, verse 27. After 2 years had passed, one verse, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. That's the next Roman governor of Caesarea Philippi. And Porcius Festus goes, "Why we got this guy sitting in a Roman dungeon here? Who's he?" "Oh, Felix locked him up." "Oh, well, let him out." 2 years go by. Porcius Festus, since he wanted to grant Jews favor, Felix left Paul in prison. 3 days after Festus had arrived and heard, he meets with Paul and he lets him out and sends him on his way to Rome. Okay, Paul spent 2 years in a Roman prison. We don't know anything about it. We don't know what he was doing. We don't know who he spoke to. He was just sitting there rotting, man. And he was paying for his financial stewardship of the gifts that all these people around the Roman Empire had given this Jerusalem church. He sat there in prison, and if Felix had lived 50 years, he would have sat there 50 years. Because he was honest with the money he collected. So that's a side note, but it makes us think, wow, okay, let's make sure we're reading these narratives right. These guys sometimes had very difficult lives. It wasn't all exciting. 2 years. Okay, so that's 59 AD. Paul's let out of prison. He gets on a boat with a Roman legion. He sails around to Crete. You've heard about the story of the shipwreck there. He spends a winter over here at Malta. And then he ends up in Rome. Now, lots of the New Testament epistles were written from Rome. While Paul's in Rome, he meets a guy named Onesimus, who was a former slave of a guy named Philemon, who lived over here. Paul writes the book to Philemon, most likely from Roman imprisonment. Okay? The book of Hebrews most likely comes from this time where Paul is in Roman imprisonment, and that's the end of Paul's story. The book of Acts ends with Paul in Roman imprisonment, and we don't know what happened to him next. Jewish tradition tells us that Paul got out of prison in Rome and went on a fourth missionary journey, perhaps dying somewhere even farther west in Spain. But we don't know that. Okay? So the book of Acts ends in about 62 AD with Paul living in Roman imprisonment. That's the book of Acts. Okay? So we've talked about the Gospels, we've talked about Acts, now we've talked about the epistles. The word epistle just means letters. We have Paul writing all these letters around the Roman Empire. We also have other people writing letters as well. So Peter, James, John, some of the other New Testament writers were those Jews. Remember in Galatians or in Acts 15, I told you that when the Jewish community decided to spread the gospel around the Roman Empire, they got strategic about it. They said, "Paul, you go and preach to the Gentiles. Me and James and John will stay here and we'll preach to the Jews." Well, they in fact did that. And they also wrote books as well. Peter wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. James wrote the book of James. Think about that. We have a letter from James, the brother of Jesus, declaring that Jesus is in fact who he said he was. I mean, if there's anybody who would have known different, it would have been Jesus' brother, you know? Jude, another one of Jesus' brother, wrote a New Testament epistle. John wrote 3 New Testament epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And they're all doing the same thing. They're all writing them to specific regions in this Roman Empire as they encourage the New Testament church in the reality of Jesus, just like Paul did with his New Testament epistles. Most of Paul's letters happened early in the New Testament era, say from the ascension of Jesus with his resurrection here in, let's just say 42 AD, potentially with the first one, maybe the writing of the book of James. Most of Paul's letters take place from 42 AD right through to 60 AD. And then we have the writings of the Peters and Johns, which were the later New Testament epistles, probably after Paul's death, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that's a basic framework of the New Testament. So here's what I like to say. What do we have in the New Testament? We have a story It's a story, and Acts is the background of these guys from Jerusalem who got lit on fire by the resurrection of Jesus. It was his resurrection. They look at him and they're like, oh man, we killed the Savior because we didn't realize he was the Savior. I mean, go back to Acts and read the first 7 chapters of Acts. You have person after person testifying to the fact that we Jews, I mean, read Stephen's sermon in Acts 7. He says, we Jews killed the Messiah. I mean, and where did that get him? Killed. Yeah. Right? And so the story of the book of Acts is these Jews who'd been lit up with passion for Jesus, just spreading this information around the Roman Empire. Almost every New Testament epistle happens that way. Okay? That leaves us with just one book, the book of Revelation. And yeah, I'll do the book of Revelation justice in a few minutes. The book of Revelation was probably the last book written in the New Testament era, in my opinion. It was written by the same guy who wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, John the disciple of Jesus. Okay? John, as an old man, Jewish tradition tells us, became the bishop of Ephesus, that town right there. And as late as the 90s AD, so 60 years after Jesus died, John is living and ministering in Ephesus right here. For his testimony to the life of Jesus, he gets exiled to a little island just off the coast of Ephesus, Patmos. It's not on our map. Okay? While he's on that island, he gets this vision from God, this revelation of the person of Jesus. And he writes it down and he distributes it to the 7 churches that he was most familiar with, because they were the 7 churches of Asia Minor around the town of Ephesus where he lived. If you read the first 4 chapters of the book of Revelation, you're going to see little letters written to each one of these churches. Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Smyrna, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Do those names sound familiar? Yeah. These are the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And John just describes to them what he saw from these angels on this island of Patmos. And here's the basic message of the book of Revelation. Wow, you know what? We have a God who wins in the end. We have a God who wins in the end. There is going to be a time where God is going to conquer the things that, as we sit here today, we have not yet seen him conquer. Suffering, sickness, death, violence, oppression. Let me tell you why this is so important. This is why we're ending with this. What if we just discussed the entire New Testament as this? Wow, you know what? We have a God who saved us from sin, our real enemy. He's given us eternity with him. Well, that's fantastic, but my husband died of cancer. You know? Well, that's fantastic, but I'm broke. Well, that's fantastic, but I saw my kids fed to the lions. When's that going to end? Well, that's what the book of Revelation addresses. And that's how the New Testament ends. And it's a real hope for us, that we can declare as Christians what John saw from this angel, and he declared to the churches of Asia Minor. You know what? We've got it both ways, and they're both good. That God has in fact solved our real enemy, the enemy of sin. He's given us freedom from that as we trust Jesus for salvation. But there is also coming a time where we will exist in a world without sin, suffering, sickness, death, hardship, persecution. But that's not a now thing. That's a post-second coming of Jesus thing. So we have the book of Revelation, where John from this island just encourages these 7 churches to look to the final event of the church age, which on your timeline here is the second coming of Jesus. And in a very highly symbolic and metaphorical way, John points his church to look at the reality that God is in fact going to deal with suffering, sin, sickness, and death once and for all. We will have a world where they do not exist. But that will not come to fruition until the second coming, when Jesus himself comes back again to finally make all things right. And I'll say this about heaven and the reality of heaven. Is there any hope? Absolutely there is. And I want to do, since I have 4 minutes, I'm going to do a 4-minute teaching on heaven, and then we will ask some questions. Here's the picture of heaven in a New Testament concept. And it is so far removed from what we see on TV and what we learn in church, quite frankly, which is this sort of ethereal never land where we float around on clouds and we all turn into angels with wings on our back and we play harps and we have a never-ending sing-along with God. I mean, who wants to go to that kind of heaven? What kind of hope is that? I mean, that sounds awful to me, you know?
You don't like to sing, Jerry?
Yeah.
Play the harp?
Yeah, I mean, but are you a harpist?
No, I want to do the singing and dancing thing.
Oh, there you go. I mean, there will be singing in heaven, but we will not exist in this huge auditorium where the better you were, the closer you are down to the stage. And if you're really awful, you're way up and you can just see Jesus on the pulpitron. And you've got to hold your hands up. Man, hold my hands up, man. I'm tired of worshiping. But I have to because it's heaven. I love you, God. I mean, it's just awful. Okay, here's the picture of heaven. And this is the picture in Revelation. It's also the picture in the New Testament epistles. It's also the picture in the Old Testament. That God is going to undo all the awful things that we brought into this world in the garden. Think about it. What was heaven like before this story ever happened? God puts Adam and Eve, the apple of his eye, the image of his creation, in a beautiful, tangible place. Free from suffering, sickness, death, and heartache. Until Genesis 3, where all of those things flood into a world in which they still exist because of our rebellion against God. And here's the revelation of heaven, and here's the hope that we have in the New Testament, and it ends with the Gospel of Revelation, or the book of Revelation, that God is going to in fact win in the end. He is going to undo that stuff. And we will return to that garden. And the book of Revelation ends like this. We don't, and this comes from this rapture theology, which is not biblical. I'm going to just say that for you. It is not in the Bible. You will not find it. Okay, and we can talk more about that. This idea that we're going to get sucked up off of planet Earth and just float out into heaven and take off into ethereal never land. No. The only place in the New Testament where we see this idea of meeting Jesus in the air is in Thessalonians. But guess what? We meet him in the air and then we return back to a physical, tangible reality where he is king of the cosmos, like he should have been in the garden. And we enjoy reality with him, free from what we brought into it. Sin, suffering, sickness, and death. In other words, God's going to create a new heaven and a new earth. The book of Revelation ends like this. Heaven coming back to us. The second coming of Jesus. I want to just affirm that and encourage you in that. That God is coming back to this world that we've wrecked without him. Yeah. And if I had to guess what heaven's going to look like, it will be strangely familiar to what we are seeing right now. Except for you won't covet, and you won't hate, and you won't envy, and you won't suffer, and you won't hurt, and you won't die. And I look forward to getting really good at rock climbing in heaven. I went today, and I'm shaking as I'm climbing, Fruit Loops, hoping I don't fall out of this crap. After 900 million years of rock climbing, I'm going to be climbing 514 like a boss.
You should just wish for wings.
Yeah, right. Hey, here's the picture of heaven. I mean, it's the last thing I'll say. The things that existed in the garden will exist there, in my opinion. God sets Adam and Eve up in this beautiful garden. He says, okay, now mess with it. It's not like, it's till it, change it, name stuff, ride the animals, do whatever. There's going to be creativity in heaven. There's going to be creation in heaven as we create with a beautiful creator. I mean, I look forward to being a boat builder. I'm going to spend a couple thousand years living in the heaven version of Bahamas, building a sailboat, man. Why not? Yeah. And I look forward to that. We have this incredible hope where God wins in the end, and what it looks like for him to ultimately win is he finally does deal with the other enemies, suffering, sickness, and finally death. That's the reality of the New Testament. Okay, so that is a lot. But that's how the story goes. So, any questions? Yes, Joe.
So for all eternity, Terry will have some weeds to pull.
No weeds, yeah.
That's heaven. But thorns and thistles are gone.
Yeah, no thorns. Yeah, but you know what? I do think there will be work. I really do. I think there will be work.
Yeah.
There was work in the garden, but it will be work without toil. And there's a book of Ecclesiastes that's written aimed a little bit at it. There's a difference between work and toil. Toil is where you're like, it's like Christmas Eve when you're my age and you're trying to put that awful toy together and it's 4 o'clock in the morning and you just want to crush it because you can't figure it out. The sun's almost up and you're like, argh. That will not exist. Yeah.
When you do something you love, you never work a day.
Yeah, that's right. Any other thoughts or comments? This story of
What I really look forward to seeing is the straw eating lions.
the what?
The straw eating lions.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's
Yeah.
gonna be pretty cool.
It's
in there. It's in the book.
It is. It's in Isaiah. It's in several of the prophets. We see the prophets in the Old Testament era, way back. Oh, it's going to show you on the timeline, but back here, writing into this time where God completely undoes the hardship of life. So much so that now lions are lying down with lambs. It's like, wow.
It'd be really neat.
Yeah, creation restored to that extent, where there's not even strife in the animal kingdom.
Exactly.
I'm gonna ride a zebra. Okay. Well, thank you guys. I know that was a lot. So if you'd like a copy of those two weeks previous handouts, they're right here. And if you got any questions about specific books, man, it's so much fun to talk about